Alright, so in Chapter 6, we're going to talk about the skeletal system. And as always, the question that we always have to answer, or that I always ask at the beginning of the chapter, is how does structure determine function? So there's a couple guiding questions that I'm going to have for you to think about. So the first one is, how did the shape of the bone influence the movement of the joint? So when we actually start talking about the shapes of bones, we're going to specifically pay attention to the shapes of the joints and how the shapes of the joints influence the amount of movement that joint can have. And then the second question is, how does the formation of osteons differ from trabeculae, which we're going to talk about today, which in turn determines the function of compact bone versus spongy bone. Right? So compact bone and spongy bone we've talked about briefly in the previous chapter, but when we talk about compact and spongy bone in this chapter, we're going to talk about how different their functions are. So the first thing we always talk about are what are the functions. So in terms of the functions of the skeletal system, the first one is support. So the skeletal system provides a framework, right? And that framework supports vital organs, supports you, maintains posture. The second function is protection. So for example, like bones of the skull, right? Particularly the cranium or your ribs. These guys provide protection to house or protect your vital organs. The second or third function is movement, right? So like we talked about before, when two bones come together, this forms a joint. And how this joint is shaped, or how these bones fit together, will determine the type of movements that joint can have. And then the fourth function is storage. So bone acts as a storage center, right? In particular, it's going to store something called yellow marrow and red marrow. Yellow marrow is fat, right? It's going to have some fat component to it. And yellow marrow will be used as an energy source. And then the second type is red marrow. Now, red marrow is a substance found within this thing called the medullary cavity. And within red marrow, you are going to find these things called stem cells, which we kind of talked about in the previous chapter. And those of you guys that did your projects, you might have come across the word stem cells. Stem cells are unique because stem cells have the ability to become any type of cell if programmed correctly. And then the last function is blood cell production. So within your bones, within this thing called the medullary cavity, you have these things called stem cells, and as I mentioned, stem cells can become any type of blood cell, in this particular case, and these blood cells will eventually become or differentiate into a red blood cell, or a white blood cell,